'Twas the night of the vote, and all through the hall the tenants were cheering the loudest of all. The signs were held high in the cold evening air in hopes that a rent freeze soon would be there. The board took their seats with their figures in files, 6 picked by the mayor who'd campaigned for miles. On one simple promise he made his whole run: freeze the rent, over and over till the race had been won. Then up to the front the loud chanting arose, 0%! And the whole crowd froze. 7-1 down the gavel did fall, the first 2-year rent freeze in the history of it all. The renters spilled out to the street to rejoice, a victory won by the volume of voice. But back in the buildings the owner sat still, running the math on a much harder bill. For the freeze holds the rent, but the costs do not freeze, not the taxes, the upkeep, or the insurance fees. The boiler still dies when it's frozen outside, and the bill to repair it will not be denied. So the owner cuts back on the things they can cut. The staff, the repairs, and all the upgrades are shut. The building runs down with its problems deferred, and the tenant who cheered gets a home that's gone worse. Now, this is New York, and you might say to me, so that's 3,000 miles away from the units that I know. But policies travel and slogans take flight, and California has lived through this very same fight. So here's the real lesson, no spin and no fluff. Cap what comes in, not what goes out, and it's tough. A freeze looks like kindness, a gift wrapped in bows, but the cost never vanishes. Landlords, it shows. I'm Chrissy Wade, broker and owner of Wellspring Property Management. For over 10 years, we have managed hundreds of units across the state of California. We know property management inside and out. So by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what happened in New York and why it can't happen here the same way it did there. California's own rent fight actually stands, and the number one thing every owner should know before any of it reaches our doors. So let's start with what actually happened, because the headline is doing a lot of the work. On June 25th, 2026, New York City's Rent Guidelines Board voted 7-1 to freeze the rent at 0% on 1-year and 2-year leases. That's about 1 million rent-stabilized apartments, and it's the first 2-year rent freeze in the board's history. But the headline skips the fine print. The freeze only touches rent-stabilized units, mostly older buildings, roughly 40% of the city rentals. It's not every apartment, and it's not a law. It's a yearly vote by a 9-member board, and the mayor who ran on freezing the rent had appointed 6 of those 9. This wasn't a surprise. It was a promise being kept. And here's what you need to hear, because you'll see this compared to California soon. What New York did changes nothing about California law. Different system, totally different rules. But the idea behind it is already here. So hold on to that thought for a moment. Who pays for a rent freeze? The rent suddenly doesn't get cheaper to provide a house. It just stops bringing in more money. Insurance, property, taxes, water, power, labor, none of those froze. In New York, they kept climbing. And just a year earlier, that same board had approved 3% on 1-year leases and 4.5% on 2-year leases. This year, 0. So those owners didn't just lose a race, they lost ground. You don't have to guess what happens next, because the owner said it out loud. One New York landlord put it this way: he's going to cut back, laying off building staff, deferring repairs, because it's a business, not a charity. That's the quiet cost. A freeze doesn't make housing cheaper to run. It decides who absorbs the gap, and it's the owner until the building starts to show it. But the freeze isn't the main part that California should worry about. The quieter thing is, stay with me for a moment, back to California, because this is where it hits home. We don't have a board voting on our rent. We have AB 1482, the Tenant Protection Act. It caps our annual increases at 5% plus local inflation, 10% at most, whichever is lower, and it runs through 2030. On top of that, cities like LA, Oakland, and Berkeley have their own stricter rent policies. What stops a California city from going all the way to a New York-style freeze is an older law called the Costa-Hawkins. It says local rent control can't touch single-family homes, can't touch anything built since 1995, and can't stop you from resetting the rent when a tenant moves out. That law is the wall. And people keep trying to tear that wall down. In November 2024, Prop 33 asked voters to repeal Costa-Hawkins and let cities cap rent on almost anything. Voters said no by a very wide margin. The third time that was lost after 2020 and 2018. But don't mistake that fight for being over. A statewide bill to tighten the cap moved this session before stalling, and cities are filing their own measures right now. Freeze the rent just won in New York, and slogans don't respect state lines. So the question isn't whether California has rent control, because we do, it's how far it goes next. Which brings me something to tell you today about politics and what's going on. When your revenue is capped and your costs are not, your margin is the whole game. And most owners have never run that math on their own. So we built a free self-managing cost calculator, and it shows what self-managing really costs you once you count your time, your vacancies, and your turnovers and the mistakes versus handing it off to a professional. The link's below. So run your numbers before the policy runs them for you. All right, here's the most important thing in this whole video. The freeze is not a real threat. Being caught flat-footed is. The owners who survive rent control pressure aren't the ones with the most units or the deepest pockets. They are the ones who know their real operating costs before the squeeze hits, not after. Because once your rent is capped at 0, your options are gone. You can't raise your way out of it. So run your building today as if your rent is already capped and your costs are not. Because in California, under AB 1482, your revenue already is. It's not doomsday. It's just normal Tuesday here in California. So bringing it home. New York froze the rent on 1 million properties that are stabilized and changed, but it didn't change anything about California. Tenants got relief. Owners got rising costs with no ways to keep up. California already caps your rent by AB 1482. Costa-Hawkins is a wall holding stricter rent controls back, and voters have defended that wall 3 times already. The one move that protects you through all of it is knowing your real numbers before the squeeze, not after. So before you go, here's what most California landlords miss about the rent freeze. The bigger cost isn't the rise that you miss. It's the running the building for years without ever knowing your true margin. So when policy tightens, you've got no room left. Grab a free copy of the self-managing cost calculator at the link below and run your numbers tonight. If you're not already a Wellspring property management client, you don't have to worry about this. We've got you covered. If you are one, sorry about that, I misspoke. We got you covered. You can also reach me at wellspringpm.com or calling the office at 760-371-4282 extension 101. That line comes directly to me. I'll see you in the next video.